everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm very excited to share with all of you round 2 of my exploration of the Pat McGrath Huetopian Dream Mothership 9 palette. So that's this beauty over here. So if you guys haven't checked out part 1 of my review, definitely check that out for swatches, a demo of all these shades, my first impressions of this palette, and also my thoughts about the controversy surrounding the release of this palette. In today's video though, I'll be demoing these Blitz Astral shades using my Mehron mixing liquid. In my previous video, I used all of the shades dry, but since she just came out with her Intensifies wand, which is basically mixing liquid in a pen, I thought it would be fun to try these out with mixing liquid as well. In addition, in this video, I am going to do a ton of comparison swatches. So I have a good portion of my entire makeup collection on my desk right now. So I'll be doing swatch comparisons with all of my other Pat McGrath palettes, plus basically any palette that I have that has a remotely similar color story. So if you guys are interested in a demo of this palette or a lot of swatch comparisons, then just stick around. So before we go into today's makeup look, I wanted to quickly just say thank you all so much who have subscribed to my channel. We recently just passed the 500 subscriber mark, which is very exciting for me personally. When I started this channel at the beginning of this year, I really didn't know if anyone was gonna watch my videos at all. For a long time, there was just like 10 subscribers, and so I was putting out content, but you know, there wasn't much engagement. And so now I really feel very grateful that every time I put out content, some folks like it, some folks comment on it. It really helps keep me motivated and make me feel like these videos are helpful for some of you. For me, YouTube is my personal hobby, so I don't make any money at all from this channel. These are just makeup products that I've picked up for my own personal use with my own money. But I really enjoy talking about makeup and sharing my experiences, and so I hope this is helpful for some of you. And thank you all so much who have taken time to watch my videos, to like or comment on them, and of course to subscribe to my channel. It really means a lot to me. And if you're new to my channel, I hope you enjoy this video and consider subscribing. So without further ado, let's get into today's makeup. So first off, let me just explain the inspo for today's look. So the look I'm gonna try to do today is inspired by 2 looks that Pat McGrath did. One was a really smoky eye where she basically used one of her permagel liners to create a lot of depth in the outer portions of the eye. And then she used this shade over here, Astral Amethyst Moon, on top of some mixing liquid. So for today's video, I'm not gonna dip out of this palette, so I'm gonna try to create as much depth as possible just using the mattes that we have here, but I will be using this all over the lid. And then the second look I was inspired by was one where she used this multi-chrome shade as a liner, and then she actually used this shade all over the lid using some mixing liquid. And so I don't have room on my lids to do both of these, but I will be trying to use this as a liner in today's look. So to start things out, I'm gonna go in with my Wayne Goss number 16 brush into Secret Eden. And then I'm just gonna sweep this all over my lids as a transition shade. And in today's look, I'm not gonna use all of the shades, so definitely check out my previous video if you wanna see all of the shades in action. This is a pretty light shade overall, so I'm just gonna use this basically to make it easier for the deeper shades to diffuse. And today I just have some concealer on my lids as my base. And in yesterday's video, I tried these out with my Too Faced primer, and that worked really beautifully as well. Alrighty, with that same brush, I'm gonna go into Xtreme Plum Noir. And usually I would use a smaller brush with this, but because today I want a lot of smoke, I'm gonna first start out with this bigger brush and then go smaller to build it up. And as I mentioned yesterday, this shade is definitely not that deep. It's not gonna give you remotely as much depth as some of Pat McGrath's deeper mattes, but this is a lot more buildable than it might seem. And so even though it looks really light in pan, you can get a bit more opacity than you might think. And now finally with my Wayne Goss number 19 brush, I'm gonna just further try to build up that opacity. And now for the lower lash line, I'm gonna replicate what I did on the lids. So first with my mini booster, I'm going into Eternal Eden. And I'm just gonna sweep this all over the lower lash line, make it nice and hazy. And then with my G27 brush, I'm going into the deeper shade and just sweeping this on the outer third. And I usually do my entire lid before doing the lower lash line, but for today, because we're using mixing liquid, I wanted to first just get all of the mattes out of the way and then do all the shimmers together. So now for the fun part. So I did not pick up her Intensifies wand that she released with this palette because I actually just picked up this giant bottle of mixing liquid a couple weeks before she announced the wand. And so if you guys picked up the wand, I would love to hear down below what you guys have thought about it. My understanding is it's basically this liquid made into a balm and then put into a pen. And so I think it'll basically give the same effect. My impression is that the wand is just maybe a little bit more convenient if you're on the go, whereas this liquid maybe gives you a little bit more versatility if you're using a brush in terms of your placement of the liquid. But definitely let me know down below if you've tried both in terms of which one you like better or if it's worth having both of them. So last time when I used this, I poured it on a plate, but I realized you really just need the tiniest amount. So today I'm just gonna kind of swish this around a little bit and just take whatever has stuck to the cap. So there's just a tiny bit of liquid in the cap. And so with this synthetic brush from Sephora, I'm just gonna dip my brush in there and really just kind of wet it with all of the liquid. And hopefully that's enough. So I'm just gonna put this all over where I wanna put these shimmery shades. And it is erasing a little bit the mattes I put underneath, so I'm just gonna be very careful with my placement. So now going in with Astral Amethyst Moon on my finger. Oh wow, look at that. It's so impressive seeing the difference that mixing liquid makes with these shadows. They really don't have any opacity if you just use them dry. Like they're definitely more of just a light glitter topper with a decent amount of fallout. And I mean, I'm still getting some fallout today, but that's more so fallout coming off my fingers versus from my lids. So now with my Wayne Goss number 19 brush, I'm just gonna take a little bit more of the Xtreme Plum Noir shade and just use this around the edges just to make sure that everything kind of blends in a bit. Okay, so I basically resigned myself to having blue purple glitter all over my face. It's kind of hard for me to brush it off at this point. So in the future, I'll just do my base after I do eyeshadow. But I am really impressed with just how gorgeous the shade is. I mean, this is basically just a couple smoky shades plus this all over the lid. And there's so much beautiful dimension and shine just from this one shade. But of course, we're not gonna stop there. So dipping my brush back into the mixing liquid, I'm going to just add a little bit more to the inner thirds because I actually want to layer on top the Astral Venusian Orchid shade. And so just with a finger, I'm going to dab this on the inner thirds. Wow, look at that shine. So pretty. Okay, this one is not having as much fallout. I think honestly with the previous shade, I just put way too much on my finger, and so even though it was sticking to the mixing liquid, a lot of it was still just like flaking off my finger. Wow, look at that. And now with that mixing liquid covered brush, I'm just gonna run some of this on my lower lash line as well. And taking my builder brush from Sonia G, I'm gonna kind of replicate what I have on the upper lash line. So in the middle portions, I'm gonna put this Astral Amethyst shade. And then I'm also just gonna dab some Astral Venusian Orchid as well. Alrighty, so we definitely have a lot going on the eyes right now, but just for the sake of playing around, let's see if I can use the multi-chrome shade as a liner. So first I'm going in with the smudger side of this brush into the mixing liquid. And in case you guys were wondering, the reason I'm doing it with two brushes where I wet one brush and then go in with a dry brush into the shadows is I just want to do whatever I can to avoid any possibility of hard pan. So I think this way my eyeshadow palette won't come in direct contact with the mixing liquid. So I'm going to do this one eye at a time. So first I'm just going to dot this along the lash line. And it's not feeling that wet, so maybe I need to actually go in with a different brush. Okay, I'm gonna try this larger brush instead, and then use just a dot along the lash line. It does erase a little bit of the pigment, so just be aware of that. And starting with my Wayne Goss number 5 brush, I'm gonna just sweep this along the outer portion and see if I can create kind of a slight liner shape. Okay, kind of. It's not showing up a ton, in part because we already have so much happening on the lids. Let me just add some more mixing liquid. Ooh, there we go with the liner. Alrighty, so here we go with the flick. Wow, okay. That's a really fat wing. So yeah, this is an interesting look to say the least. Let me see if I can just reduce the size of the wing a little bit. Let me go in now with a thinner brush just to see if I can refine that a little bit. Okay, definitely took that out a little bit far. I think this is definitely a look where I'm mostly just kind of trying out what you can do with these shadows, but I wouldn't recommend putting all of these elements together in one look. And we're back. So it's amazing what a makeup wipe and some concealer can do. So I was thinking I would need to probably redo a lot of this look, but actually with the bottom part cleaned up, I think this is a pretty fun look. It's definitely not a look I think I will be recreating anytime soon. There's a few too many elements on my eyes, but I think this is still a passable look. And other than the liner being way too thick and way too far out from my eyes, I think this is still a pretty interesting look that showcases a lot of the special effects that this palette has to offer. And I also just went in with a tiny bit of black eyeliner just next to my lash line for a bit more definition. So to finish off this look, let me first just add a little bit more mixing liquid to the inner corners of my eyes. And then going in with Bronze Solaris 005, I'm just gonna press this just to the inner corners of my eyes. Alrighty, so now we are done with the mixing liquid part of today's look. I would say that in comparison to the time when I used my mixing liquid with my Pat McGrath Sublime palette, this palette definitely has overall much more chunky shades, and so you do need to layer on the mixing liquid quite a bit more. And so I ended up going through several brushes in order to get enough layers of this on my lid to really have the shadows adhere. So that's just one thing I wanted to note, because I think if you get the wand, you also might have to really get a decent amount of the balm on your lids just to make sure there's no fallout. So now to finish off this look, I'm gonna first go in with my soft definer into the Skinshow shade and just use this along my brow bone. Not that we need any more highlight happening in this look, but hey, might as well, right? Go big or go home. And I'm also just gonna take a tiny bit of that on the tip of this brush just to diffuse a little bit the edges of the Bronze Solaris shade. And in my previous video, I went in with Shockwave as a blush. So for today, I'm gonna go in with Eternal Eden. And I'm just gonna put this all over my cheeks with my Sonia G Cheek Pro. And this is actually not too pigmented. I feel like you can actually build this up as a blush and not be too careful with it. Really pretty color. This reminds me actually a lot of her Divine Rose blush, so that is going to be one of the comparison swatches coming up. And finally, with my Wayne Goss Artist Small, I'm just gonna take some of that Skinshow shade and bring, wow, okay. This is, I took a little bit too much, I think, of the Skinshow shade for this. This is looking very wet. Alrighty, so here we have the finished look. What do you guys think? I would say that I am really glad that this look came together. I was a little bit worried that I was combining too many elements, and that worry did pan out. I think this is a little bit too much on the lids. Your eye is kind of just like drawn to all different sorts of things because there's just so many special effects going on. That said, the purpose of today's video was to see how these shades perform with mixing liquid, and so I did just want to use all 4 of these and make sure they could show up in some prominent place on my eyes. So I think I did succeed on that side. Overall, I would say realistically, probably most days when I use this palette, I'm just gonna use this dry and then go in with these last 2 shades more as a a glitter topper. But on days when I want something super hyper sparkling, I think that these two do look really, really gorgeous with mixing liquid. Just be careful about the fallout aspect. Maybe do your base afterward, or just pick up a tiny amount on your fingers when going into those shades. I would say having this as liner, I don't find the flip to be super noticeable. It's more like it kind of looks dark in certain light and in other light sort of blends in with the rest of the eyeshadow. And so from that standpoint, it's not my favorite shade for liner, but it is more interesting than just using a single metallic shade as liner. So now that we have this makeup look out of the way, let's get into swatch comparisons. So when I first saw this palette, the first thing that came to mind for me was this quad over here reminded me a lot of Divine Rose. And then this quad over here reminded me a lot of Divine Rose too. So let's first do those comparisons. So here is Utopian Dream next to Divine Rose. So on the bottom here, we have the first quad from Utopian Dream. And then on the top here, we have Divine Rose. So you can see that these are actually quite different. So first off with the Skinshow shade, the one in Divine Rose is more of a pure champagne shade, whereas the one in Utopian Dream actually has some pink in it. And then Valoria is a lot cooler toned and more purpley compared to the pink Secret Eden. I would say the deepest matte shades are somewhat similar, but with Extreme Plum Noir just having a little bit more cool toned plum to it. And then Cosmic Bloom is quite different from the rose shade in Divine Rose. It has much more pink and copper to it. Here it is next to Divine Rose 2. So again, Utopian Dream is on the bottom and Divine Rose 2 is at the top. So first off, we have Divine Dusk versus Bronze Desire. And Bronze Desire is definitely a lot deeper and thicker and creamier, whereas Divine Dusk has more light to it and is a little bit more rosy in tone. There's more burgundy in Bronze Desire. And here I would say the colors are actually quite similar. The biggest difference is in formulation. So the Utopian Dream shade is a lot more chunky and more of a glitter topper in formulation, whereas the bronze shade in Divine Rose 2 is a much smoother but less high shine, less glittery finish. Here we have Shockwave versus Naked Blush. And so Shockwave is just a little bit punchier, definitely more reddish coral in there, whereas Naked Blush is a little bit more muted, a bit more peachy. And then finally we have Sextraterrestrial versus Blitz Sextreme. And I would say that even though the flips to these are somewhat similar, Sextraterrestrial definitely has more magenta and more green, whereas Blitz Sextreme has more bronze and more of a burgundy tone to it. So looking at these, if you exclude the bottom two shades of Utopian Dream and you have Divine Rose 1 and Divine Rose 2, you can definitely get a pretty similar looking palette, especially if you have Divine Rose 2. I wouldn't say any of these are pure dupes for each other, but there's definitely a lot of similarities. As a side note, yesterday after I finished filming, I realized that the boxes between Divine Rose 2 and Utopian Dream are quite similar. You can see they both have that rose crown and then the spikes coming out of it. So I feel like this might have originally been a Divine Rose 3, but then got rebranded as Utopian Dream. I mean, you can see that same rose crown over here. Next, I wanted to compare this with the Eternal Eden quad, which I consider an honorary member of the Divine Rose family. So Eternal Eden is on the bottom and Utopian Dream is on the top. So you can see that Pink Mystique has a lot more of a bubblegum pink shade in comparison to Cosmic Bloom. Similarly, Temptation is much more of a hot pink in comparison to Shockwaves Coral. Earthly Delight is actually quite similar to Extreme Plum Noir, but just a little bit more purple in undertone. And then Forbidden Fruit has more rose to it in comparison to Bronze Desire. Now let's see how this compares with the Fleur Fantasia quad. So here we have the comparison with Fleur Fantasia on the bottom and Utopian Dream on the top. So first off, Skinshow Nude Xtasy is a little bit more of a platinum shade compared to Huetopia, which has more yellow to it and is also less high shine. Lavender Blue from Fleur Fantasia is also much more of a satin finish compared to the very, very high shine finish of Astral Amethyst Moon. Iridescent Orchid from Fleur Fantasia is actually a higher impact shade in comparison to Cosmic Bloom, which is a little bit more sheer and also has more of a warm tone to it than the Fleur Fantasia shade. Finally, I was actually surprised how similar Lotus Paradise and Shockwave look. Lotus Paradise is just more like a sheared out version of Shockwave, and Shockwave has a little bit more coral than peach. And because Pat McGrath used a lot of Sailor Moon inspo for this palette, I wanted to compare this with the Sailor Moon palette from Colourpop, which has a pretty similar overall color story. So I think I might have just found a much cheaper dupe for this color story. So here we have on the bottom all of the shades from Huetopian Dream, and then on the top some of the shades from the Sailor Moon Colourpop collab. And so, of course, the quality of these shadows is extremely, extremely, extremely different. I could tell that instantly from the swatches. But you can see overall, the color story is actually pretty similar. And there's a number of shades that look like they're more or less close dupes. So I would say this first shade, the Skinshow shade, is quite similar to two of the shades in the Sailor Moon palette. Eternal Eden is also reasonably similar to the Moon Castle shade. There wasn't a great dupe for Bronze Desire, but the Bronze Solaris shade does have kind of a golden bronzy counterpart. Of course, there's nothing quite like the Blitz Astral shades in Pat McGrath's palettes, but there are some shimmery shades in the Colourpop that have similar colors to them. The Colourpop one does not have a deeper plummy shade though, so this was kind of the closest I could find. And then Cosmic Bloom didn't have a great dupe, but similar color. Shockwave was actually really similar to Tuxedo Rose, so that was interesting to see. There are no multi-chromes in the Colourpop, but there is this Mare Serenitas shade that is a chunky glittery shade. And then finally, the Luna shade is a very different texture than the Astral Amethyst Moon, but they do have very similar colors to them. So if you're not quite sure if you like the color story of Huetopian Dream, you might want to look into the Sailor Moon Colourpop collab. I can't say I really recommend this palette in that this is a palette I bought for collector's reasons because I'm a huge Sailor Moon fan, but I don't actually use this palette or really like the quality of the shadows in it. But of course, this palette is super cheap in comparison to the Pat McGrath, so it is potentially worth looking into if you're only interested in the color story. So now that we've done all the comparisons of the palettes that really reminded me of this palette, I want to now just go shade by shade and show you guys any sorts of comparisons I can find with the rest of my Mothership collection and also my other eyeshadows. So if you watched my first video review of this palette, you know that I was really intrigued with the Skinshow shade in this palette. It felt much creamier, slicker, and a little bit more opaque than any of her other Skinshow shades. And so I actually swatched all of her Skinshow shades, which I know is a little bit overkill, but I do think I've confirmed my suspicions. This does seem to be a different formula. So it might be a little bit hard to see on camera, but this first shade over here is Skinshow Nude Xtasy. And then I have the rest of the Mothership palettes in descending order, excluding Decadence and Subliminal, since Decadence does not have a Skinshow shade, and Subliminal has the same Skinshow shade as Divine Rose. And then over here, off to the side, I have the Skinshow shade from my Golden Opulence palette. This new one is a little bit more high shine, a little bit thicker, a little bit creamier and more liquid in consistency in comparison to the rest of these. Overall, I would say in color, Huetopian Dream looks most similar to the Skinshow shade in Midnight Sun. Both of them are these really beautiful platinum champagne shades. There is a little bit of a peachy flip though to Skinshow Nude Xtasy, which I haven't seen in any of these other shades. I think basically in terms of tone, it kind of looks like if you mixed these three together. So Divine Rose 2, Divine Rose, and Midnight Sun. So next up we have Eternal Eden, and I went into a lot of my other palettes to search for a dupe for this. So the first shade I thought of was Venusian Orchid from Celestial Divinity. And you can see here they're quite similar, but Venusian Orchid is a little bit cooler and much more pinky in tone in comparison to Eternal Eden. Next up we have the Divine Rose Blush. And this one is also just a little bit cooler toned, a little bit more mauvey in comparison. And then I went into October Odyssey from the On the Horizon palette from the Tentalia Sydney Grace collab. And this one is quite similar, but again with a little bit more mauve. Basically, Eternal Eden is actually a lot more warm toned than it comes across. Next up, we have the Pillow Talk shade from the Pillow Talk quad from Charlotte Tilbury. And this one might actually be one of the most similar in tone. It's a little bit lighter and less opaque in comparison to Eternal Eden, but if you're a fan of Pillow Talk, you'll probably like Eternal Eden. Next, I went into this pinky shade from my Magic Hour palette from M Cosmetics. And this I would say is a lot more peachy in comparison. And then finally, I went into this lighter matte shade from Natasha Denona's Mini Love Story. And this one is definitely the most different. Very cool toned, very purpley. Overall, I think the closest dupes I have to Eternal Eden are actually Moon Castle and Lotus Paradise, which is surprising because I think of those as much more peachy toned shades, but I guess Eternal Eden actually has a lot more warmth to it than you might expect. Also, I think Pillow Talk is a decent dupe. Next we have Bronze Desire, and similar to the Skinshow shades, I have the rest of the Motherships in descending order, skipping Subliminal since there was nothing remotely similar. So here we have Bronze Desire, then we have the bronze shade in Divine Rose 2, Divine Rose 1, Midnight Sun, Bronze Seduction, here's Blue Blood from Decadence. Then I mixed up the last two, so here's the bronze shade from Sublime, and here's the bronze shade from Subversive. So I would say that Bronze Desire looks a lot like the bronze shades in Divine Rose 2 and Divine Rose 1 had a baby. Alrighty, so now we have Blonde Solaris 005. And the moment I saw this shade, I immediately thought of the Bronze 005 shade from Sublime. And you can see they are definitely very, very similar. I would say the main differences are that the Bronze Solaris 005 has a little bit more gold and rose to it, whereas the Bronze 005 from Sublime has a little bit more bronziness. Also, the one in Utopian Dream is even more chunky than the one in Sublime, even though I thought the one in Sublime was chunky enough. I also just have the golden bronze shade in Bronze Seduction, which I think is similar shade-wise, but is in a totally different finish. And then once again, I have the Bronze Rosé shade from Divine Rose 2, which has a little bit more pinky rose to it, and is also in a smoother finish. So next we have Astral Venusian Orchid, which is definitely one of, if not the most unique shade in this palette. And so there are definitely no dupes with my other Motherships, but these were the closest shades I could find. So first we have Astral Pink Moon, which is much more of a straightforward glitter topper shade. It doesn't have any flip to it or any base. And then we have VR Fire Opal from Bronze Seduction. And this is the most similar in terms of being a glitter with a flip. But ultimately, these are pretty different shades in that the purple is much more prominent in the Utopian Dream shade. Next, we have Astral Ghost Orchid, which is in both Subversive and Sublime. And this is a totally different texture. It's much more chunky and three-dimensional and doesn't really have any base pigment to it. Lastly, we have two shades from Subliminal. So here's the shade that has a little bit of lavender, a little bit of blue in it, and here's the one just with the blue reflect. I would say the base flip in this one is much more of a copper pink that goes to that lavender blue, whereas this is much more lavender blue with a golden greenish flip to it. Definitely the closest comparison though is with VR Fire Opal from Bronze Seduction. So that's on the bottom, and on the top we have Astral Venusian Orchid. So my arm feels like it's about to fall off, but there we have the first row done. Now let's get into the second row. So here we have the comparisons for Xtreme Plum Noir. And I would say there isn't anything in my collection that's an exact dupe, but I do have a lot of mattes that are quite similar. So here we have the deepest matte in Divine Rose 2, and then Divine Rose 1, Bronze Seduction, two of the mattes from Celestial Divinity, Mothership Mega, Then we have Eternal Opulence and Pillow Talk. So Xtreme Plum Noir is definitely not the deepest of these mattes. I would say that it looks a little bit like the two mattes in Divine Rose 2 and Divine Rose 1 had a baby. So it has that plumminess from the Divine Rose 2, but it also has a little bit of brown warmth. It also looks reasonably similar to this mahogany shade from Celestial Divinity, but with just a little bit more plum in the Utopian Dream. It also looks quite similar to the Golden Opulence matte. Compared to Pillow Talk, it has much more plum and is a little bit deeper. So here we have the comparisons with Cosmic Bloom. So first off, because the shade is called Cosmic Bloom, I immediately thought of the shade Cosmic from my Celestial Divinity palette. So that's right here, and you can see this is both lighter, and also this guy has a flip from a copper to a pink, whereas Cosmic Bloom is just a coppery pink shade. Next, I wanted to compare it with the shade from the Natasha Denona Mini Love Story. And this shade is actually overall quite similar, but again, the difference is that this has a dual chrome effect to it that goes from the copper to the pink and is slightly more cool toned in comparison to Cosmic Bloom. Next, we have this pinky coppery shade from Bronze Seduction. And you can see that this is just a little bit lighter, a little bit peachier in comparison to Cosmic Bloom. Next, we have VR Nectar from Sublime. This is also much lighter in tone, and it has a pretty strong golden flip to it. It's a little bit hard to see on camera, but if you look at it at an angle, you can definitely see more peachy gold. And then finally, we have VR Pink from Subversive. And this one just has a much more cool toned pink to it, so definitely not nearly as saturated of a pink as Cosmic Bloom. So next we have Shockwave, which is the shade I was surprised to see that I actually have very few dupes for, but I do think I found some shades that look reasonably similar. So first off, over here we have Naked Blush from Divine Rose 2, which is actually one of the most similar shades in my current collection, but is a little bit more peachy and muted in comparison to Shockwave. And then I went back in with the shade from the M Cosmetics Magic Hour palette. So that's over here and much lighter and peachier in tone. And then possibly the closest dupe I found was this shade over here from the Viseart Petit Pro 2. So that's over here, and you can see it's a little bit more muted, a little bit more powdery, but the overall shade is actually quite similar. And then the other strong similarity, which I showed you guys earlier, was with Tuxedo Rose. And that's the last shade here, which actually has sparkles in it, but overall it comes across as a matte. This is just a little bit more pinky and vibrant in comparison to Shockwave. So here we have the comparisons with Blitz Sextreme. So I have the Utopian Dream shade here, then I have Sextraterrestrial from Divine Rose 2, Color Flip from Natasha Denona Triochrome, and Corruption from the Celestial Divinity palette. And here they are arm swatched. So I'm actually quite surprised to see that Corruption is actually by far the most similar shade. So this is again from her Mothership Mega Celestial Divinity palette. And this is more of a duochrome shade, but it does have that same sort of bronze to burgundy flip to it. Honestly, on the lids, you don't see a ton of the third flip from Blitz Xtreme. So if you already have the Celestial Divinity palette, this is a really great dupe. Sextraterrestrial has much more of a pink fuchsia shade to it, and also the green flip is much more prominent, whereas the flip for Blitz Sextreme mostly looks bronze. And then Color Flip is quite similar to Sextraterrestrial, just a little bit more muted. And she also did change her multi-chrome formula between Divine Rose 2 and Utopian Dream. So we have Sextraterrestrial on the bottom and Blitz Sextreme on the top. And you can see that Blitz Sextreme is much more metallic, much more liquid in finish, whereas Sextraterrestrial is a little bit more sheer, a little bit more muted. And you can see here that Blitz Sextreme is a pressed pigment, whereas Sextraterrestrial is more of a baked gelée similar to her other Blitz Astral shades. So here we are with the final shade comparison. So this is Astral Amethyst Moon, and next to it I have the shade from Midnight Sun, which is much more blue periwinkle. There's minimal purple to the shade. Then I have the shade from Subversive, which has a little bit more of a grungy blue tone to it. Then I have the shade from Subliminal, which is almost more of a glitter topper, very light, doesn't have the same base pigment to it. And then there were a couple shades I thought were similar in Celestial Divinity, so I swatched this guy and then this guy. So first we have this shade over here, which color story wise is probably the most similar to Astral Amethyst Moon, but is in a totally different finish. And then we have this one over here, which is much more of a smooth violet. And then I was also curious about this Kinetic shade from the Trio Chrome palette. So that's over here, and you can see this is much more blue and also much more of a satin metallic finish. Next up, from the Sydney Grace Temptalia collab, I have the Quintessence palette and this Aurora shade. So that's swatched over here, and it's overall a cooler color story, but actually has more of the purple to periwinkle flip that you see in Astral Amethyst Moon. And then finally, just for good measure, I included Luna again. So that's over here. And why not? Let's also just swatch Lavender Blue again. So overall, I do not have any dupe for the final Blitz Astral shade, but I do have a lot of shades in my collection that try to do this sort of purple to blue kind of color story. Alrighty, so those are all of the comparison swatches that I could find in my eyeshadow collection. So hopefully this was helpful for any of you who are on the fence about this palette and want to see if there are similar shades that might be in your existing collection. Overall, I'm quite happy that I did all of these comprehensive swatches because I was quite impressed actually to find that there weren't more exact dupes in my collection. Obviously, for each of these shades, I had a decent number of similar shades. But especially when you factor in formulation, this palette is actually a lot more unique than I expected. So I would say that if you love this color story, if you love Pat McGrath's textures and formulations, then I would highly recommend going out and picking up this palette. Overall, I'm really pleased with my first two looks with this palette, and I can't wait to continue playing around with it. So thanks so much for sticking around to the end of this video. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. I would love to know in the comments down below what you guys think of this palette, given all of these comparison swatches. Let me know if you'll be picking it up. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!